Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people's story. Let me start from the beginning so you understand how these entitled people brought this entirely on themselves. I'm 32 and inherited my grandfather's ranch about 3 years ago. It's a beautiful 2,000 acre property that borders a state park in what used to be the middle of nowhere. The place has been in my family for 4 generations, and while I grew up visiting every summer, I wasn't exactly prepared to run a working cattle operation. I had to learn fast. The ranch is gorgeous, I'll give you that. Rolling hills, a pristine private lake, and some of the best grazing land in the county. Problem is, since the state park next door became popular with social media influencers posting pictures, I've had more and more people thinking my private property is their personal playground. It started small, people parking at my gate to hike on what they assumed was public land, groups setting up picnics in my front pasture. The final straw was when someone left a gate open and 20 of my cattle ended up wandering onto the highway. Thankfully, nobody got hurt, but that was pure luck. After that incident, I got serious about security. I installed motion-activated cameras disguised as birdhouses throughout the property, all connected to a cloud server I can access from my phone. I put up professional signs every 50 yards along my fence line that read, "Private property, no trespassing," and all activities monitored by video surveillance. The most important signs read, "Active Biosecurity Zone. Unauthorized entry prohibited by state agricultural law. Violators subject to fines and decontamination fees." That last part wasn't just for show. When you run cattle, biosecurity is a real thing. Unknown people and vehicles can introduce diseases that could wipe out my entire herd. The state agricultural department backs this up with hefty fines for people who ignore these warnings. I also had my lawyer draft up a fee schedule for damages and posted it at every entrance. Most people see the signs and turn around, but apparently some folks think rules don't apply to them. Last month, I had to drive into the city for supplies, about a 2-hour trip each way. I was standing in line at the feed store when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from one of my cameras near the lake. I opened the app expecting to see deer or maybe a coyote. Instead, I watched 2 minivans drive right past my biggest no trespassing sign like it was invisible. 8 people got out, 2 middle-aged women who immediately started directing everyone else around like they owned the place, their husbands, and several kids. I zoomed in with the camera and could clearly see one of the women point directly at my sign, laugh, and say something that made the others chuckle. They weren't lost or confused. They saw the signs and just didn't care. Here's where I made a decision that probably saved me a lot of headaches. Instead of rushing back to confront them immediately, I decided to let them get comfortable first. I switched between cameras and watched them set up a full camp with multiple tents, coolers, camp chairs, the works. I was recording everything in high definition with timestamps. They built a fire pit, which was already a problem since we were in dry season with fire restrictions. Their kids started chasing my cattle in the adjacent pasture, and then I watched them all strip down and jump in my lake, which is the primary water source for my livestock. Each of these actions was triggering biosecurity violations that carried serious fines under state law. I made sure to capture every moment from multiple camera angles. I finished my business in town and drove back the next morning, giving them plenty of time to really settle in and rack up violations. When I pulled up to their campsite in my work truck, they'd clearly been there all night. I got out wearing my usual work clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt, and walked over to where the 2 women were making coffee over their illegal fire. I kept my voice friendly and polite. "Morning, ladies. I think there might be some confusion. This is private property." The first woman, probably in her 40s with that "let me speak to your manager" haircut, looked me up and down like I was something she scraped off her shoe. She told me I was obviously just the groundskeeper and that nature didn't belong to anyone. The second woman chimed in that they weren't hurting anything and would be gone in a few hours, so I didn't need to get bent out of shape. She added that it wasn't like the owner even used this spot anyway. Their immediate assumption that I couldn't possibly be the owner was probably what sealed their fate. I remained calm and clarified that I was indeed the owner and they were trespassing. I asked them politely to pack up and leave. That's when things went sideways fast. The first woman's whole demeanor changed. She told me I was harassing them and that they had rights. She threatened to call the police on me for bothering families with children. The second woman started ranting about how I couldn't just kick them out into the wilderness. Both husbands were standing there looking embarrassed, but not saying anything to rein in their wives. While they were arguing with me, I took a good look around their campsite and mentally cataloged the damage. There was a large scorched patch where they'd built their fire directly on the grass. Plastic bags, food wrappers, and beer cans were scattered everywhere. Their minivans had driven directly across my newly seeded pasture, leaving deep tire ruts in the soft soil. Worse, I could see their kids over by the fence trying to pet my cattle, which was dangerous for everyone involved, and the fact that they'd all been swimming in the livestock water supply meant I'd have to pay for expensive water testing and potentially treat the entire herd if they'd introduced any contaminants. That's when my polite demeanor disappeared. I didn't get angry exactly, but I switched into business mode. I pulled out my phone and told them that I'd given them the polite way out. Now we were doing this by the book. I called the sheriff's department on speaker so they could hear. When Sheriff Miller answered, I explained that I was down at the lake with the group of trespassers I'd called about yesterday and that they were refusing to leave after causing significant damage. I mentioned that I had everything on video and needed a deputy to escort them off my property. You should have seen their faces when I mentioned calling yesterday. The color just drained right out of them as they realized this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. While they were processing that, I walked back to my truck and grabbed my clipboard with the laminated fee schedule that was posted at every entrance. I handed it to the first woman and watched her eyes get wider as she read down the list. Criminal trespassing citation issued by the sheriff's department. Unauthorized camping fee of $500 per vehicle per night, so $1,000 total since they'd been there overnight. Trash and debris cleanup fee of $300 minimum. Pasture and land restoration fee of $1,500 for reseeding and repairing the tire damage. Livestock disturbance and endangerment fee of $1,000. And the big one, biosecurity decontamination and water testing fee of $2,500 as per state agricultural guidelines. I turned my phone around and showed them the crystal clear footage of them driving past the signs, setting up camp, littering, and their kids harassing my cattle. I had timestamps for everything. The woman holding the fee schedule was reading it out loud to her husband, and his face was getting redder by the minute. The second woman was demanding to know if this was even legal, and I assured her it absolutely was, pointing to the state agricultural codes referenced on the fee schedule. About 20 minutes later, Deputy Johnson pulled up. I've known him for years since he patrols this area regularly and has helped me with trespassers before. The two women immediately launched into victim mode, claiming I was harassing them and extorting money from innocent families. Deputy Johnson listened patiently, then asked me for my side. I calmly handed him my phone with the video evidence and the copy of my fee schedule. He watched about 30 seconds of footage before nodding. He explained to the families that the trespassing citations were non-negotiable based on the video evidence. He said the damage fees were a civil matter, but given the clear documentation I had, they would almost certainly lose in court and end up paying my legal fees on top of everything else. That's when I made what I called my generous offer. I told them I'd rather not waste everyone's time with court proceedings. If they settled the damage bill right there, I wouldn't pursue further civil action, which would be much cheaper for them in the long run. The husbands looked absolutely furious with their wives at this point. After some heated whispering between the couples, they grudgingly pulled out their wallets and credit cards. I happened to have my mobile card reader with me since I use it for selling cattle, so they could pay the full amount right there. $6,300 total. The most expensive camping trip of their lives. Deputy Johnson supervised while they silently and frantically packed up their gear. You could cut the tension with a knife. The kids kept asking why everyone was so mad and nobody was answering them. The final image that still makes me smile was watching their two minivans being slowly escorted down my long driveway by the patrol car, making sure they actually left the property. After they were gone, I stood in the clearing taking in the silence. The scorched grass and tire ruts were ugly reminders of their visit, but at least now I had the funds to fix everything properly. I used the money exactly as advertised, hired a professional restoration crew to reseed the damaged pasture and repair the soil compaction from their vehicles, paid for a full-spectrum water quality test on the lake and had to treat it with UV sterilization as a precaution. The rest went toward upgrading my security system with additional cameras and better signage. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with entitled people. Being polite and reasonable often doesn't work because they interpret it as weakness. Having clear rules, proper documentation, and legal backing is what actually gets results. 3 weeks later, I got a call from my lawyer saying someone had filed a complaint with the state agricultural department claiming I was running an illegal fee scheme. The investigator who came out reviewed all my documentation, watched the videos, and concluded that everything I'd done was completely within my rights as a landowner protecting a legitimate agricultural operation. Apparently, the complaints had come from the same two families who were trying to get their money back by claiming I'd scammed them. The investigator told me this kind of retaliatory complaint was common and that my case was actually being used as an example of proper documentation and legal compliance. A month after that, Deputy Johnson stopped by during his patrol and mentioned that word had spread in the area about what happened. He said trespassing incidents on ranch properties had dropped significantly because people were finally taking the signs seriously. I've had exactly 0 trespassing incidents since then. Turns out when word gets around that private property signs aren't just suggestions, people tend to respect them. The ranch is more peaceful now than it's been since I inherited it. My cattle graze undisturbed, the lake stays clean, and I can focus on actually running the operation instead of dealing with entitled tourists who think the world is their personal playground. Those families came to my ranch seeking a free vacation and probably a social media story about their amazing camping adventure. Instead, they left with a $6,000 bill and a police escort. I hope they learned that private property signs aren't just decoration. They're a promise that if you break the rules, you'll pay for the consequences. In the end, they did contribute to preserving my beautiful land, just not in the way they planned. Every time I look at the restored pasture and upgraded security system, I'm reminded that sometimes the best way to deal with entitled people is to let them face the full legal consequences of their actions. Their bank statements became their souvenir, and my ranch became a lot more secure. I call that a win-win situation, even if they probably disagree. The funniest part is that if they just asked permission in the first place, I probably would have said yes for a reasonable camping fee. I've let neighbors use the land for family gatherings before when they approached respectfully, but entitled people don't ask permission. They just take what they want and expect everyone else to deal with it. Well, they dealt with it all right. $6,000 worth of dealing with it. I kept copies of all the documentation from this incident, including the videos and the payment receipts. My lawyer suggested it would be good evidence if I ever had to deal with similar situations in the future. So far, I haven't needed it, but it's nice to know I'm prepared. The whole experience also taught me the value of investing in proper security systems and clear signage. It cost me several $1,000s up front, but it paid for itself with that one incident and has prevented countless others. Sometimes I wonder what those families tell people about their camping trip. Do they admit they ignored private property signs and got caught? Do they claim they were victims of some elaborate scam? Honestly, I don't really care as long as they stay off my land. The important thing is that my ranch is protected, my cattle are safe, and other potential trespassers know there are real consequences for ignoring property rights. That's worth more than any amount of money to me, but getting $6,000 to fix the damage they caused was pretty satisfying too. Update 6 months later. The gift that keeps on giving well. I figured I'd update everyone since this story keeps getting more ridiculous. Remember those entitled families who thought my ranch was their personal campground? Turns out they weren't done making terrible decisions. About 2 months after the camping incident, I got a call from my insurance company. Apparently, one of the families had filed a claim against my homeowner's policy, claiming they'd been injured on my property due to unsafe conditions. They were trying to get money for emotional trauma and financial damages from what they called my illegal fee scheme. My insurance agent was actually laughing when she called. She said it was one of the most obviously fraudulent claims she'd seen in 20 years. When they asked for documentation of the alleged unsafe conditions, I sent over the complete video footage showing them ignoring safety signs, building illegal fires, and letting their kids harass livestock. The insurance company not only denied their claim, but flagged them in the system for filing a fraudulent claim. Apparently, this makes it much harder and more expensive for them to get insurance in the future. But wait, it gets better. 3 months later, Deputy Johnson stopped by with some interesting news. Remember how I mentioned they'd filed complaints with the state agricultural department? Well, those complaints triggered an investigation, but not the kind they were hoping for. The state investigator had been so impressed with my documentation and security setup that he'd recommended my ranch as a model operation for other landowners dealing with trespassing issues. I actually got invited to speak at a state agricultural conference about property protection and biosecurity protocols. Even better, the investigator had looked into the backgrounds of the people who filed the complaints. Turns out the first woman had a history of similar scams in other states. She'd been filing false injury claims and trying to extort money from small businesses for years. The investigator passed this information along to the district attorney's office. Fast forward to last month, and I got the most satisfying phone call of my life. The district attorney's office was pressing charges against the woman for filing false reports and attempted fraud related to her complaint against me. They wanted me to testify about the incident if it went to trial. I gladly agreed, but it turns out they didn't need my testimony. When faced with the mountain of video evidence and documentation I'd provided, plus evidence of her pattern of fraudulent behavior in other states, she took a plea deal. The terms of the plea included paying restitution to all the businesses she'd tried to scam, including an additional $2,000 to me for my time and legal expenses. She also got 2 years probation and community service. Her husband apparently filed for divorce during all this. Deputy Johnson heard through the grapevine that he'd had enough of her schemes and didn't want to be associated with her criminal behavior anymore. The second family seems to have learned their lesson and stayed out of trouble, but I heard they moved to another state shortly after the incident. Probably wanted a fresh start somewhere their reputation hadn't followed them. The absolute best part came last week. I was at the feed store in town when the clerk mentioned that someone had been asking about my ranch. Apparently, a family had come in wanting directions to that place where you can camp for free near the state park. When the clerk told them it was private property with serious security and that people had been arrested for trespassing there, they immediately changed their minds. Word has definitely spread in the area that my ranch is not the place to try your luck. I also found out that 3 other ranch owners in the county have installed similar security systems and fee schedules after hearing about my situation. One of them actually prevented a major trespassing incident last month when people saw the signs and cameras and decided it wasn't worth the risk. The state agricultural department has started using my case as a training example for other landowners about proper documentation and legal protection. They even featured my security setup in their newsletter as a model for biosecurity protocols. Oh, and remember that mobile card reader I used to collect payment? I've actually had to use it 2 more times for much smaller incidents. Word hasn't completely gotten around yet, but when people see the signs and realize I'm serious about enforcement, they usually cooperate pretty quickly. One guy tried to argue that $500 was too much for driving across my pasture to get to the lake. I showed him the video of his truck destroying my newly planted grass seed and asked if he wanted to pay the full restoration fee instead. He paid the $500 and left immediately. The restoration work on the pasture is completely finished now, and you can't even tell there was ever any damage. The grass actually grew back thicker and healthier than before. The lake water tested clean after the UV treatment, and my cattle are all healthy and happy. I used some of the extra money from the restitution payment to install even better cameras with night vision and license plate recognition. If anyone does decide to trespass again, I'll have even more detailed evidence to work with. My favorite upgrade is the new automatic gate system with intercom. Now when people pull up to my main entrance, they can't claim they didn't know it was private property. There's a big sign explaining that it's a working ranch and that tours or visits require advance permission. Most people read the sign and turn around immediately. The few who use the intercom to actually ask permission have been surprisingly respectful. I've allowed several photography groups to visit for a small fee, and they've all followed the rules perfectly. Turns out when people ask nicely and respect boundaries, I'm pretty reasonable to work with. I've also become something of a local expert on property protection. Other landowners in the area regularly ask for advice about security systems and legal procedures. It's actually become a nice side business helping people protect their property the right way. The whole experience taught me that entitled people rarely learn from consequences, but other people definitely learn from watching entitled people face consequences. The story has spread far enough that it's actually preventing problems before they start. I still get motion alerts from my cameras several times a week, but now they're mostly just wildlife or the occasional lost hiker who turns around as soon as they see the signs. The days of people setting up camp and refusing to leave are definitely over. The ranch is more peaceful now than it's been in years. I can focus on raising cattle and maintaining the land instead of constantly worrying about trespassers. My grandfather would be proud to see the place thriving and properly protected. And every time I look at the upgraded security system and restored pasture, I'm reminded that sometimes standing your ground and following proper procedures pays off in ways you never expected. Those families thought they were getting a free vacation. Instead, they paid for my security upgrades, helped me develop a reputation that prevents future problems, and one of them even got criminal charges for their trouble. I'd say that's about as close to perfect justice as you can get in the real world. The moral of the story remains the same, though. Private property signs aren't suggestions, they're promises. And if you're not prepared to keep those promises, you shouldn't put up the signs in the first place. Fortunately for me, I was very prepared to keep my promises, and now everyone in the area knows it. The next one is a pro-revenge story. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come into work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary, where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years, and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that, without making any mention of Jane's threat to retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned/retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a "good morning" as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire! I'm not ready to retire!" Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire! I'm not ready to retire!" while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ travel agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. The next one is a malicious compliance story. My mom's always been passionate about school, and to be fair, sometimes that passion comes from a good place. She can be super supportive when she wants to be. She'll hype me up before a test, help me go over flashcards, and so much more. She cares. But today was not one of those supportive days. Today was one of the days where that passion was misplaced. I told her, super reasonably, that I had 5 difficult assignments, but was planning to do 2 today and finish the other 3 tomorrow. A completely normal, time-managed strategy. But she just stared at me like I was plotting a heist instead of managing my homework. Total silence, total judgment. Then she said the thing that flipped the switch. I want proof, screenshots, or it didn't happen. Like I was lying. Like I was sitting in my room pretending to do work while secretly building a pillow fort. I just said, okay, and walked away. Calm, collected, not because I agreed, but because I had a plan. Enter Cherry Inc. CEO of Malicious Compliance. She wanted screenshots. I was about to turn her request into a full-scale production. I didn't just screenshot the completed assignments. No, I gave her a full digital timeline of every step I took. Screenshot. Opening Google Classroom. Screenshot. Navigating to the classroom. Screenshot. Opening the assignment. Screenshot. Creating the Google Doc. Screenshot. Naming the file. Screenshot. Typing the first answer. Screenshot. Submitting it. Screenshot, checking that it uploaded. Every single screenshot came with a watermark I designed myself. Screenshot taken for mom proof. Verified by Cherry Inc. It looked legit, like a government-issued seal of academic validation. When I started sending them one by one, she finally responded. Okay, what's with the watermark? A little obnoxious. I didn't flinch. I just said, you said, screenshots or it didn't happen. I wanted to make sure you knew it was accurate. She paused. blinked, and then dropped what I'd been waiting for. I did indeed, because I can't trust you. So I looked at her and said, without missing a beat, you said screenshots or it didn't happen. And it very much did. So yeah, she got her proof. She got all of her proof in high res, with timestamps and branding. Anyway, thank you for watching.